Assalamu alaikum everybody. Welcome back to our reasoned analysis series, Do Words Matter? And once again to discuss this, I am joined by Mr. Shabir Yusuf. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam rahmatullah.
So today we will be
to
discussing the word faith. So can we start with the definition again, please?
Well, what we usually do is start off with the definition. And the definition of the word faith gives us a strong belief in the doctrines of religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. That is the standard definition of the word faith. A strong belief in the doctrine of religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. As our dear viewers will be aware, we had already discussed the word religion and how in our submission the word religion should not really be applied to the belief systems that we had discussed previously. So the definition is actually bringing out two aspects that I would submit need to be considered. One is that it is based on a spiritual conviction rather than proof.
So that means something intangible.
Precisely. Well, it depends. What we are talking about here is the word spiritual. And what I would suggest is we look at the word spiritual and the word proof, so it gives us a better understanding of exactly why the definition may not necessarily be an appropriate one. So we find the word spiritual is relating to or affecting the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical, as you rightly pointed out. So the word spiritual is associated with things that are intangible. Now the word proof, again, very interesting for our viewers. What is proof? It is the cogency of evidence that compels acceptance by the mind of a truth or a fact.
Can you say that in English?
The word cogency basically is suggesting a quality of being clear, logical, and convincing. So that is what the word proof is. Now you will note that already from the definition that we are considering today, it is talking about aspects that do not require proof. In other words, the very definition of the word faith is counter to what we would consider to be reason, evidence, and proof.
Seems that way.
Correct. So, I would want to ask the question, which one therefore comes first? Does evidence precede proof or does proof precede evidence? As we noted, proof is the cogency of evidence. So the question automatically arises, which one comes first?
Most people use these two terms interchangeably.
They do.
Including myself.
They do. I would submit that there is a subtle distinction that needs to be made. Evidence is the collection or body of information which needs to be assessed, and out of that, whatever information is clear, logical, and convincing then becomes proof. So I would submit that there are two things that we have to consider. Does evidence precede proof or does proof precede evidence?
What you've said, evidence precedes proof.
I would submit
because evidence leads to proof.
Correct. So it is evidence that precedes proof. So again, going back to the definition, we find that it is proposing a conclusion before even having considered the evidence.
So why does what you have said so far matter in the context of the word faith?
Right, excellent question. As our viewers will be aware, we as human beings develop words and we apply those words, and those words actually affect the way we think and the way we approach matters. Now, if we just consider how currently in the world we are using language and on what basis, as we had said in the previous episodes, and I would submit again that the majority of the information that we are utilizing is from a Judeo-Christian perspective. Yeah? So we need to consider very carefully whether perhaps the words that have been adopted in the dictionary were as a result of only considering belief systems from the perspective
that perspective, the
from the
Judeo-Christian.
Judeo-Christian perspective.
Okay.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, we will find that the majority, as I just said, the majority of the information we learn about comes from what we collectively consider, and not in a negative way, a Western perspective. And one of the interesting things is to look at how all the very famous, or how can we put it, very well thought of individuals and what they said about certain matters. Okay? Yeah. In that respect, if we look at the late Bertrand Russell and what he said in the context of the word faith,
and who was he, sorry?
He was a polymath, a person who was very good at very many things. And his writings were extremely, and still are, very popular. Now, we will be considering Bertrand Russell. We will also be considering what Professor Richard Dawkins has to say about the word faith, and also what the philosophical perspective is in relation to how the word faith actually is considered. So, if we find Bertrand Russell, this is what he had to say. Christians hold that their faith does good, but other faiths do harm. At any rate, they hold this about the communist faith also. What I wish to maintain is that all faiths do harm. Wow. This is what his perspective was. And he goes on to say, we may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. So again, he is equating faith with no evidence. Where there is evidence, he goes on to say, no one speaks of faith. We do not speak of faith that 2 and 2 are 4, or that the earth is round. We only speak of faith when we wish to substitute emotion for evidence. The substitution of emotion for evidence is apt to lead to strife, since different groups substitute different emotions. This is what he was stating. And he goes on to state, Christians have faith in the resurrection, communists have faith in Marxist theory of value, and he goes on to finally say that neither faith can be defended rationally, and each therefore is defended by propaganda and, if necessary, by war.
Wow.
So the sum and substance of what the late Bertrand Russell stated was that anyone who carries faith as a necessary foundation is entirely basing it on an absence of evidence.
Just on emotions.
Just based on emotion. Now, I would submit that the view that he holds is as a direct result of having the definition being used wrongly in the first instance. And that is what I would submit. Now, that is what Bertrand Russell said. Now, we go on to the evolutionary biologist, Professor Richard Dawkins. And what he does is he just criticizes all faiths by generalizing from specific faith in propositions that conflict directly with scientific evidence. His view is that he will criticize on a general level any proposition that conflicts directly with scientific evidence. He describes faith as belief without evidence, a process of non-active thinking. So again, we have Professor Richard Dawkins.
Active non-thinking.
Exactly. He describes faith as belief without evidence, pretty much like the late Bertrand Russell. But he goes on to say it is a process of non-active thinking. I'm sure our viewers will be able to conclude what he is actually meaning here. Now, he states that it is a practice that only degrades our understanding of the natural world by allowing anyone to make a claim about nature that is based solely on their personal thoughts and possibly distorted perceptions. That does not require testing against nature, he goes on to say, and it has no ability to make reliant and consistent predictions and is not subject to peer review. Now, it all looks very long and drawn out, but the sum of it is, as Bertrand Russell stated, faith entirely is something
Illogical.
that is illogical and not based on evidence. Professor Richard Dawkins goes a bit further, and he actually states that it is a process of non-active, or rather active non-thinking. So again, the word faith, when it is being applied here,
Yeah.
and if we were to compare it to what the belief systems actually state, I would submit again is totally wrong, and the way it is being applied. Now, as we stated, we were looking at also philosophers and what philosophers say. The philosopher Peter Boghossian, he argues that reason and evidence are the only way to determine which claims about the world are likely true. So we find that these individuals are basing their understanding of the world on evidence, on reason and evidence, and basically it concludes to proof. Yes.
Now, looking at that, you can now understand why many people who profess to be of no faith here make a mockery of people who they feel have a faith.
I can fully understand the approach that they are taking. You see, when you are looking at the word faith, the moment you start thinking that it is absent of any evidence, then everything becomes myth. Everything becomes something that is not to be taken seriously. And so when certain rituals are undertaken by the people who profess a belief system, and these very individuals who are basing their understanding on the words like faith, when they view this, to them it seems funny why human beings would indulge in such primitive methods of worshipping something that is not there, that is according to their view. But you will note that individuals like Richard Dawkins are suggesting that people who adhere to a faith indulge in a process of active non-thinking. And again, as you rightly pointed out, that when you look at individuals, you think, what's wrong with them? Why are they wasting their time in things that are totally illogical, irrational, and unreasonable? Well, I would submit that this all results from the usage of words that I would suggest are actually alien to the very belief systems that we are looking at. Now,
so can we now have a look at what the belief systems say themselves?
Yeah, just before we go there, just to point out what Professor Richard Dawkins said on his website, our Dawkins Foundation. He said, critical thinking is the real savior of humankind. In this particular statement, I entirely agree with Professor Richard Dawkins. And if Professor Richard Dawkins had considered the belief system scriptures on an evidential basis, he would have possibly found that there is critical thinking involved, and this we are going to touch on later. But going back to what you said, if you look at the belief systems, what do they actually say? Now, the first one that we are going to touch on is Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism. Correct. Yeah. It again is considered a belief system which consists of duties, practices, these very practices you were suggesting or alluding to earlier on. Yeah. Now, the Hindus have scriptures. There are a multifaceted amount of scriptures, but the thrust of the scriptures is to do with the Vedas. The word Vedas actually means knowledge. And they go into subdivisions. Yeah. But the point is that the Hindus themselves will consider all the information that is in these books, in the Vedas especially, because they are four of them, the Rig Ved, the Samved, Yajur Ved, and Atharva Ved. These are different aspects of the Vedas, okay? I would submit that if you look at the evidence in these particular scriptures, you will find that it is not at all suggesting that anything that is believed has to be entirely based on the absence of evidence. Now, just because I'm saying this, it doesn't necessarily mean that the internal potential conflicts of these particular scriptures that we are going to be discussing are to be taken as a given. That is not what I'm saying. What I am basically saying is that, look, when you are using the word faith and comparing it to what the belief systems actually say, you find that the word faith is being used inappropriately.
But what you're also saying is that the actual scriptures might have inconsistencies themselves.
Potentially.
Internally.
But
Yeah.
again, you will find that for you to actually establish these inconsistencies, you need to consider the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a different discussion altogether. However, we find that in Hinduism, the very basis of the word is knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't blind faith or an absence of evidence. That is what it says. Now, if we move on to Judaism, you find that they actually employ a particular word, and that word is emuna. What does it say? What does the word emuna mean? For them, it is an innate conviction, a perception of truth that transcends rather than evades reason. You will note that the philosopher Peter Boghossian said, reason and evidence are the two things that will show us what the world and what it contains is likely to be true. So here we are being told that the word emuna that the Judaism employs is an innate conviction, a perception of truth that transcends rather than evades reason. Now, you will note that although it is considered to be innate, this can only be enhanced through reason, through study, through experience. And all those would require evidence. So again, you find that the definition of the word faith is not applying to the Hindus or the Sanatan Dharma, nor is it applying to the
to Judaism.
Okay.
What about Christianity?
Excellent. With Christianity, you find that anytime you are discussing anything, the information that is contained in the Bible is what would have to be considered. Now, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, there is a statement which, you can understand about this Judeo-Christian perspective. In 11:1, it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Well, that seems to align with Professor Richard Dawkins.
About the word faith. However, if you look at that particular book of Hebrews, the verses after verse 1 actually go in context explaining what that actually means. Basically, for example, it talks about Abraham being told about certain things that are going to happen. And Abraham, entirely basing his trust on the Creator, does what he does without actually knowing what the potential result is going to be. So if you apply a certain context to this, you will understand, again, it is not actually using the word the way it has been applied by Professor Richard Dawkins or the late Bertrand Russell.
But if you just take that one phrase by itself, you would.
Yeah, if you take just the word faith. However, like I said, we need to, if we are approaching something, then we need to look at the evidence as a whole. And you find in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah chapter 1 verse 17, a statement reads, come, let us reason, saith the Lord. Now, why is it asking us to reason? And how can you reason without considering evidence? And the Bible actually goes a bit further. In 1 Thessalonians 5:21, it actually states, prove all things, hold on to that which is good. Now, as I said earlier on, we are not here discussing the potential inconsistencies that may be found in the various scriptures. What we are trying to do is establish whether the word faith is the appropriate word to use against the belief systems. And in the context of the evidence that we are considering right now, it can clearly be seen that the word faith and the way it has been applied to the belief systems is actually wrong.
Yes.
Now,
agreed.
So 1 Thessalonians 5:21 is saying, prove all things, hold on to that which is good. How can you prove things? As we had stated earlier, evidence will precede proof. and proof will actually come from the evidence once the evidence has been assessed. So you find that even Christianity, if you look at what the Bible states, is actually asking for evidence and reason to be considered. And Professor Peter Boghossian, the philosopher, had stated two words: reason and evidence. And both are being considered in the scriptures so far that we have touched on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we look at Islam, what does Islam say? As I said earlier on, Professor Richard Dawkins had made that statement about critical thinking is the savior or will be the savior of humankind. And I agreed with him. Had Professor Richard Dawkins studied the Quran, he would have entirely agreed with it. I'm not talking about the way he views Islam. I'm talking about, had he studied Islam, he would have found within the Quran the very thing that he has stated: critical thinking. And critical thinking must be applied. So you find
and it's encouraged to.
Absolutely. Now, the interesting thing about the Quran, and I would submit, it may sound as though I'm being biased because I'm a Muslim, but that is not the case. I'm looking at the evidence. The Quran seems to be unique in terms of a scripture.
In what way?
It starts off in Surah 2 verse 2 by stating, this is a book wherein there is no doubt. In normal circumstances, what we would say is, the conclusion has been given. And then the evidence is going to be considered. For a confident statement to be made, you must have everything in place. Otherwise, you are not going to be able to make this statement. Now, the statement reads, this is a book wherein there is no doubt. So it has already told you what this is going to consist of. Now, are we being told this is a book wherein there is no doubt and do not question it?
No.
Just believe?
Well,
No, it doesn't.
Not.
It is not saying that. And it also states, like I said, it has formed a conclusion, and now we are looking at all the evidence that confirms why this conclusion has been reached. So the first thing that we find in Surah 15 verse 9, it tells us, Inna nahnu nazzalna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun. Wa inna lahu lahafizun. In other words, the Creator is the one who revealed this, and it is the Creator who will protect this. Now,
from corruption.
From whatever corruption or whatever else. The interesting thing is that we are being told it was a revelation from the Creator. Now, logic would actually dictate, Surah 2 verse 2 talks about this is a book wherein there is no doubt. If the Creator has revealed this, then logic will dictate that there will not be any corruption, there will not be any error, there will not be any inconsistencies at all. But that logic is based on firstly understanding if there is a Creator. That is a logic that has to be applied. However, that is what it says in Surah 15 ayah 9. Now, in Surah 12 ayah 108, the verse says, this is my way, I invite to Allah with insight.
What does that exactly mean?
What does the word insight actually mean? It is a capacity to gain deep understanding. Now, to gain deep understanding, one would have to look at all the available evidence. A lot of people would actually suggest, well, sometimes intuition works.
It doesn't always.
But it doesn't always. What is intuition? It is the ability to understand something instinctively without the need for conscious reasoning. And sometimes that can actually be wayward. Yeah? So we are looking at how to gain insight. And I would submit that looking at the context of the Quran, it is again talking about evidence. In Surah 38, ayah 29, the statement reads, a book which we have sent down to you full of blessings that you may ponder over its verses. How does one ponder? How does one reflect? How does one think? It certainly is not going to be on the basis of blind faith, I would submit. It would actually be on the basis of considering evidence, and that evidence would have to be objective. So we find that is what it says. Now, it not only states that, the Quran goes on to say that there are going to be people who are going to make claims and how to deal with them. So in Surah 2, ayah 111, claims were being made by the Jews and the Christians in the context of that particular verse. And they made claims, and the Quran instructs us to state, Qul, say unto them, Hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqeen. Produce your proof if you speak the truth. Now, logic would apply that if the Quran is instructing us to seek evidence and proof from individuals, then necessarily the verses that we have just mentioned are also asking us to look at evidence. It's not only that, the Quran actually states, if you do not consider this Quran from the Creator, you will find discrepancy within. Now, that's an interesting verse from Surah 4 verse 82. Yeah? It is saying to humanity, if you do not think that this is from the Creator, then therein find a discrepancy. Now, here is an interesting thing. Surah 21 ayah 30 states, do not the unbelievers see the heavens and the earth were joined together and we clove them asunder. Now, in normal circumstances, this statement would be considered to be a scientific statement or alluding to some natural phenomenon. And it is asking us to consider this. Now, whatever the evidence that may be contained in the Quran is going to have to be critically analyzed to establish whether it confirms what Surah 4 verse 82 says. So we find consistently the Quran is talking about evidence and proof. Evidence and proof. It's requesting us to reflect. It's requesting us to reason. It's asking us to consider and ponder. Now you can only do that, I would submit, on the basis of evidence. So it is clear that even on a cursory note, that I'm talking about Islam in this context, yeah, on a cursory note, you will find that the word faith and the way it has been defined and what Bertrand Russell and Richard Dawkins have stated
doesn't apply.
It not only does not apply, it clearly would not make sense when it is applied. It just will not make sense. Now, if they are so wrong in their assessment, one would want to ask the question as to whether they actually did what they are asking others to do and actually considered the evidence. I would submit the only potential reason they may not have done that was because they used the definition of the word faith and actually blindly believed it. Possibly. That is what I would submit. Perhaps, perhaps not. But from what has been said, it seems very clear that the writers themselves did not take the very advice that they are giving to people. True. So in the final analysis, we find that the word faith and the way it is defined is not and cannot be applied to the various belief systems, in particular to Islam. It just does not fit. So I would humbly request our viewers to consider next time when they use words like religion, faith, etc., seriously consider it before actually applying it, because there is a potential of doing a disservice. There is a potential. Yeah. And it is highly encouraged to actually start looking at the origin of the words, because as I have stated consistently, that our view currently is based on a Judeo-Christian perspective.
And that's how our mindset is
framed. And because words are developing in our minds, the mindset actually approaches things accordingly. So I would suggest that if there is a rational argument to be provided, it has to be on the basis of evidence. And the evidence clearly shows in the Quran that everything must be based on your critical faculties,
Yeah.
consider the evidence, and establish the proof.
Okay, I think that's correct from what you've said. It all seems logical.
Oh, thank you very much. That is very kind of you. She's considered me to be logical.
For a change.
It's a miracle.
For a
Okay, we
change.
need to define the word miracle. Yeah, so the Creator willing, our next episode is going to be on the word belief. That is yet another very, very important word which we need to consider. The sun was shining a few minutes ago, and I was making a comparison between the sun and you, and trying to work out which one shines more, you or the sun.
Flattery gets you nowhere, dear.
We tell the truth, it's a problem. We don't say anything, it's a problem. What can we do, us men?
Okay.
Okay.
Meanwhile, it's Assalamu alaikum from him.
Assalamu alaikum.
And it's Assalamu alaikum from me.